When I was finally done with the game, I had time to reflect on it, and I thought it feels a little bit like it has the same theme and feel and sort of the sensation of a Godzilla film, but in reverse. Those films get a unique perspective from the way that they focus on the giant monster rather than focusing on like the supposed relatable characters of the film, right? There are these human beings in the background while the main focus of the film is on the monster. This game basically captures that same feeling but from a different perspective, observing things from a human perspective.
This game, what's so surprising about it is it's about a war, a potentially world-ending war, and yet we know so little about the actual enemy, and we know so little about what the war is and what's at stake and who the heroes and villains are, and we just focus on the people at the bottom. Specifically, these are people who aren't directly engaged with the war at all. The game really took me by surprise. It starts up and you're just on this roof somewhere, and you're just a bunch of kids. You're just a courier supposed to deliver packages. You don't even know what packages you're delivering or why. Along the way, you're just taking photos of things. And the game is super simple in terms of its goals. It's just like, oh, take a picture of like some cans and get a skateboard and take a picture of your friends. And everything seems kind of goofy. I initially thought like, oh, it's just going to be Pokemon Snap where I'm focused on getting perfect images. Quickly, it starts to unfold that like, oh, the world that you're in is horrifying. So much of the joy that you're having on this roof is so disconnected from that world, and that is a surprise. It's a narrative shock to sort of realize that early on in the game.
The most obvious way that the game gives you this inkling that something else is going on is when you're in the middle of taking these pictures, and about 2 minutes into playing the level, a row of jets appears overhead and shakes the entire rooftop that you're on. That doesn't get explained, right? And it doesn't happen again in the level. It just reminds you that this world is ignoring something. It gives you more to think about, but rather than doling out that story through audio recordings or text logs to read, rather than having more explicit explanations of the story that appear in the environment, the environmental storytelling is used as a way of just giving you enough to know that something is being concealed from you.
The environmental storytelling is so tense in that way. I got so lucky when those jets flew overhead. I was looking directly at my friends when it happened. I was actually trying to take a photo of them for that group photo, and I was looking right at them and I was telling them to change their poses, and one of them immediately begins cowering in fear while the other one is continuing to dance. The second guy is just scared. The way that he was cowering, like how he got so low as if he was trying to avoid what he felt in his bones would be some kind of blast. It immediately made clear in that second that, okay, these people at the back of their mind, in spite of whatever joy they seem to be capturing in the moment, have this sensation that anything can happen in terms of their lives. Like this whole thing could end. It was such a great bit of tension. And then the whole game is like that. Every level you're slowly learning more about what's happening, and it just feels like, okay, I'm in a haunted house that starts off comfortable. It's like I wake up in a nice bed, and over time I'm learning that this place is haunted. I'm learning that there's a torture chamber in the back. These smiles that people are putting on is a kind of facade in order to grasp onto whatever normalcy they can to make it through this horror show that we're all trapped in together. It's hard to capture that feeling of like what that was like to actually play the game. My expectation going in was that it was just going to be a photography game.
All I knew before I began the game was that this was going to have something to do with the end of the world. I knew that it was called Red Sky Generation, and I had heard some recommendations about the game that were just to the effect that this is telling a story about feeling like you are the last generation to watch the world end, which ends up being a quote from the end of the game. This game captures both the beauty and the romanticism of being able to find happiness in spite of the end of the world, but it also captures the way that things get worse by direction of their government or by direction of some organization that's telling them not to panic, and then things will get even more out of hand as a result.
This game was developed prior to COVID. It ended up being quite prescient about the disorganization that would emerge. In spite of having top-down direction from, say, government officials or news sources, the skepticism or cynicism about those sources starts to breed a kind of disjointed compartmentalizing of groups. Everyone starts separating, and they start coming up with their own hypotheses about what's happening in the world. The more statements are made about the subject, the more skeptical people become. And it really captures that nicely because there are many groups that you start to notice and see as you continue to play this game. The design of the actual gameplay is so nicely in touch with that because this game is all about noticing things. Because the conceit of the gameplay is to look for minor objects, and these are of course really minor. That's actually one of the things that's really funny about the goals that you have, is how counter the goals are to what's actually happening in the world. Like things that you have to find, they aren't like people bleeding. You're not taking photos of like evidence of crimes or anything. You're taking photos of giraffes and fans and controllers with green buttons. All these extremely trivial things. It really emphasizes the serious things as you're wandering around and you're just trying to search for all these like menial objects, these basic items of life. Surrounding all of those objects is horror. It really made it so that as I was continuing to play and like venturing deeper and deeper into this world and learning more about it through experiencing it, it really helped me see the graffiti, and it really helped me see all the factioning that was happening and like the memorials that started to show up precisely because I was told not to see them. Which I wonder if that is like a kind of analogy for the experience. You know, like when there's a disaster, there is an understandable drive from the top to have the populace not panic. And so it's like, oh, don't look too closely at these things. And you in this game, you're like tasked with focusing on all these nice things, these things that could make you feel better, like skateboards and stuff. And then as you're going, you can't help but look at the terrible things. It just becomes like a part of the gameplay, and it like really captures that nicely.
The game does give you some structure that can be very rewarding in a way that seems reminiscent of like the classic Tony Hawk games, right? Because you're given this timer in the corner and you're just told to complete this scavenger hunt within that allotted time. Right away, it's not just that the game is telling you like, don't look over here, look over here. It's like telling you like, have fun with it, like go for it, like really actually commit to like observing every corner of this world that you can. No matter what, you end up getting very familiar after just about 10 minutes or less with each level. Each level feels like a place that you've lived in because you've looked at every corner in search of what you need. The amount of intimate familiarity that creates is definitely something that I can't imagine being done with a different conceit besides photography. It's a game that is not just telling you like collect a bunch of things, it's telling you like look for the things that are out of place. Try to figure out where is there an unusual number of candles, and then you will notice that that's surrounding a memorial, and then you understand the memorial. It's telling you that you can understand the world as not just a series of signposts, but a series of consequences of those signposts and consequences of people's lives.
It's not just a scavenger hunt of finding, it's a scavenger hunt of seeing. They will have little quests where, you know, you just have to find some markers here and there or spray paint. And in the process of needing to see where the spray paint is, you have to see the graffiti. And you have to notice like, hey, that looks like a squid or something, or that looks like someone is dying in that picture. Oh, what is this message about? Like, what does the UN have to do with all this stuff? Some of the quests will be to literally look for UN helmets or UN lettering of different sizes. It sort of really begins to emphasize, oh, the UN is everywhere, right? I'm seeing this constantly around me. Those sorts of things, because they're so constant, actually become easier to fall into the background. Every game repeats textures. It's sort of a norm in video games. The rock texture is everywhere, and we drown it out as noise, as like a necessary noise for us to just experience the space. And in this game, it tries to force you, because you're trying to frame things and see them correctly, to avoid just falling back into the noise and actually like paying attention to what that noise contains. That's all the game is. Like, it's not like the objects that you have to find in the game are that well hidden. That was a little surprising to me. Like, when I initially started the game and I saw the big list of objectives, I kind of thought I was going to have to look like in really obscure nooks and crannies, and like maybe there would be secret rooms or something like that. And it's nothing like that. These spaces become simple play spaces, and the only challenge of finding each object is just that there's so much else to see, and some of what you're not trying to find is actually even more interesting, precisely because it suggests so much about this world outside of the play space that you're in.
Often the levels will have something like a bunch of craters or body bags or something. It'll have things that seem like the most important part of the level, and those are almost never an objective to take a picture of. The game starts off knowing that you have an honest and universal curiosity about those things. It's not trying to make you look at what's important. It's trying to make you look at the things that you would consider insignificant in a story. Because it knows that you're viewing it as a story, but it's also trying to present the real aspects of that story. The story that is hidden behind the story because we are actually experiencing these things in real life. The game is trying to get you to dig through, and of course you're always going to see the bigger picture, but to see the smaller pictures is the job of the game.
What a great confidence it has in the players too. The game really doesn't force you to notice any of the broader story if you don't have the curiosity to notice it. Like, you don't have to string together each clue that you happen to come across in order to determine that, oh, these people are at war and there's this sense of doom over the top of everyone's head. You could just play the game as a game and take great photos and shift the filters and, zoom in just the right way and lean, and do all those things. But there's a confidence that people are inherently curious about what they're not supposed to be looking at. People do want to make connections out of things. And that, of course, points directly to the kind of story that we're talking about here, right? Like the character that you're playing is a kid, seemingly very young. They don't say how young, but it's very strongly implied that it's just a kid with their friends. Most of the settings that you're in, you're hanging out, and there's a bunch of other kids. It's sort of a reminder to you that, even though these kids really have no direct incentive from the top to care about these issues, they will care nonetheless because they're living, and this is their home, and this is their space, and people do want to know what's going on whether you want them to know it or not. And often the effort to hide it is precisely what propels them forward to become even more curious again. That youthfulness thing was really probably one of my favorite things about it going forward, because it sort of connects to what you said about this being a Godzilla film in reverse, where the focus is so different than what you expect. And this is a war narrative. We've seen those a million times of people at war or a country being upended, and what they decide to focus on are the people who are always there. In every war story there are kids. And the nature of being a kid is this is the only life you know. And the nature of being a kid is you have incentive to just live the best version of whatever emotional state you're in, and to just fulfill that yearning that every child has to kind of just explore and experiment, because that's the best thing about being young. Even in this horrifying setting, you're gonna have kids just curious and being deviant. The deviancy is sort of the beauty of these characters. That's really surprising, honestly. Getting the narrative from the perspective of people who are just trying to live their life, but remaining just so quickly finding the boundaries of what they're supposed to do and finding ways to break it. How naturally human that feels. It's a very human story. And again, it's not even told like a story. You and I aren't certain about every detail about what we understand of this world, but by the end you do just have a sensation, or at least some familiarity with the fear undergirdling everything.
The feeling that you get from the youth in the game is really, I guess it's what is referred to as angst, but angst is kind of like a word for directionless anger, like an anger that doesn't have a way of getting to a problem, right? So it's like this powerless anger that the youth feel. That feels like a theme that not only is extremely rare and can be extremely beautiful in the way that it creates this world of details and kind of a world of pointlessness that nevertheless becomes like the only world you know and the only world you can hold on to. But it's also a theme that reminds us that like in certain moments everybody goes back to being a kid again because they feel powerless. Like if they are made to feel powerless by their environment, that angst comes back. That feeling of a crossroads of like, am I going to be angry right now, or am I going to try to supposedly grow up or try to sort of take the mature route and be calm and not panic? These are different approaches that can have different uses in different situations, right? And it becomes a choice. It reasserts itself as an option again to be angry.
One thing that isn't fully clear by the end, although that's not to say that it doesn't have an answer and that it doesn't point in various possible answers, is why you're taking these photos. I could see some of the reasoning be like, oh, this is just expression, a kid trying to express themselves. In a lot of ways, like the filters that you get and, you know, all the different goals that you have kind of fit a personal expression. It's not really about showcasing the war in and of itself. A lot of the goals, like we had said, aren't really focused on the war, so it does seem like a kid just trying to be creative. But because of how it actually feels to play, maybe this is just personal, like I really kept choosing to take photos of the evidence of what I was seeing. Like anytime there was anything of note in relation to the overarching conflict, I just took a photo of it, even though I wasn't going to get any points for that. And it wasn't fitting any overarching like guideline that was set in place. And I wonder if that was like something that was incentivized as it was going along, you know, as the development was underway with this game. Like, oh look, we're gonna put enough there that the player is just gonna do what many people would do, which is start to take notice of the fact that there's a lot of power in photography when used a certain way. Photography is a tool of evidence, of collection. And of course, it's also a tool of manipulation, because what you choose to photograph, because a photograph carries so much weight as evidence, whatever you choose not to photograph becomes erased to a certain extent. We treat photos as concrete and real in a way that the words of people aren't. There's this weird creepy thing that you start noticing that there's all these little sea creatures around you. and you're told not to photograph them. There's a discouragement to have people reveal the truth of what's happening in this war.
This becomes increasingly difficult because they are everywhere and they sort of grow in number in certain levels. It leads you to desire to avoid them, but it also makes you extremely conscious of them. And it created a really creepy sense in me from the beginning of the game, that the fact that I'm not allowed to photograph them meant that I also really needed to get away from them. Like this sense of you have to run away from the elephant in the room. It's not an idea that I've seen in a lot of games, this idea of being told to manipulate yourself, of being told to force yourself to feel a certain way about something. It's a thing that we've all experienced to some extent, usually in our youth, where you're told by adults there's a certain kind of professionalism that you're supposed to have growing up. Once you become an adult, certain behaviors and certain ways of thinking aren't going to be allowed. But then as adults, we actually realize that those very ways of thinking are often the most important. That feeling of having to not necessarily solve the actual concrete problems of having strong feelings, but just being told that your feelings are in and of themselves a problem. It's just something that I'm glad is in a thing. I'm just glad that it's in a piece of work. It's explained through the environment in such a realistic way.
It's one of the first rules, or only rules I strictly remember at the very start of the game, which is don't take a picture of the little blue sea creatures all over the place. By that very nature, it's that whole avert your gaze prohibition. There's information that you're not allowed to have. This is one of those things when it comes to any kind of major global conflict. There is an understandable reason to think that certain information is dangerous to have out there. But as soon as you define information as dangerous, you just made it the most interesting information. You just gave it even more power than it already had. It's like prohibiting foul language. Suddenly foul language has more power than any other kind of language. And it's like no wonder when you're young, you will use it ad nauseum because it becomes the only way for you to really express something truly deviant and truly vicious, because you have to go for the thing that you're supposed to not do. They capture that so perfectly by telling you to avoid these things or to not even look at them, like this isn't going to be your goal, don't look at all this stuff. That's exactly why you start looking at that stuff and start wondering about it. But what is that stuff? That was the through line throughout the whole experience. I was just curious, what are these squid things? The beautiful thing when you're going through this world is you are dealing with people who are struggling with that universal struggle of what can we know. A lot of the graffiti, a lot of the information that you can glean from the music and the words that people are expressing around you in this game is there's a lot of doubt in their world. Clearly the UN in this game is doing something, right? We see their army and whatnot. But one of the issues that gets brought up, and this especially gets brought up later in the game, is the amount of collateral damage that the UN is doing. A cynicism starts to develop. Well, is that a necessary sacrifice? And if it's not necessary, is it possible that the UN is allowing people to die because maybe they don't value our lives as much as they should? If they reach the conclusion that it's necessary to allow collateral, to allow innocent people to die, maybe that suggests something about what they think of innocent people. I don't think the game takes a strong stance on that either way. I don't think I take a stance on that either way. Honestly, it's a fictional UN, so I really don't know. It is a perfectly understandable kind of skepticism about whose interests do these people have. Even if I'm still alive in this moment because of them, are they really doing their best for me? And I think that's understandable because these people are helpless. It's like when you know that you don't have power and the one that does have power, you're going to become skeptical just because they have power and you don't. And it just feels really uncomfortable to be in that position. It is an understandable dynamic. Oh, but you have so much power. That seems very unfair for me to be in this lower position.
By focusing on the ground level of this conflict, it sort of emphasizes that there is an invasion that then leads to another invasion. And there's sort of an increased powerlessness when you realize that the invaders are supposed to save you from the invaders. No matter what, no matter who wins, you don't have any power over that. You don't have any vote or say in what's going on. It's an incredibly powerful game the more I think about it.
I guess in one sense, that loss of agency that's happening to you, the photographer, and all the friends and all the civilians who are around you, it's probably a frustration with being infantilized. You get treated as a child and you get funneled from place to place. Like many of the environments in this game, you're being taken places and you have to line up and receive approval in order to continue to the next stage of your journey. This implication, you're always being pushed around. Even if, for the sake of argument, it was truly in your best interest and, everything was on the up and up and there wasn't any corruption, it still feels undignifying. It still feels like you're being tamped down in your role in the world as insignificant. you start to feel as if you're just another thing being bounced around from place to place. And the game reveals all of this, and the emotion of all of that is contained with silence. The game never talks about this stuff directly, but the whole time I was playing, it captures it so subtly in moment to moment. Probably the best thing about this game, having played it for, it's only a few hours. It's like 5 hours long. It's like a bite-sized experience where you kind of get just to enter this universe and then come right back out, is a lot of the struggles that these characters are going through feel very true to the struggles of what it is to live in a society where you can't have all the power, and where on the drop of a dime, for the sake of an emergency, you can lose whatever little power you have. There's a truth about the nature of being young, about the drive toward trying to find hope, and also the feeling of temptation that comes with hopelessness. When you start to get the sense that you really might be the last generation in the world, there also may come a sense of non-obligation. It's like, okay, you weren't responsible enough to keep me taken care of. I don't need to be responsible for anything anymore other than myself. There's something really loving about that too, because sometimes that means friendship becomes the thing that matters most. I love that by the end of the game, at least the original portion of the game, you return to the very first stage that you were in. You start off on the rooftop where you see your friend get scared of some fighter jets, and you return to that rooftop and it has even more graffiti than before, and your friends are still just hanging out with you and you're all having a nice time. And it's like the thing that stays, that continues going forward, is whatever connection you had to individual people, even when the world is literally blowing up around you and you're losing everything. Although the actual narrative is surrounding a highly fictional war in terms of robots and aliens, the human element is, I think, very universal to any society that's in decay, wherein the youth and the other civilians within that society just want to be human again, at least for a moment. Thanks for watching our latest video. Every week we have been releasing these reviews or review discussions or analysis, and we'd love for you to come check us out each time. We try to have serious, thoughtful conversations about games. If you're curious about philosophy or psychology or literary analysis, that's mixed into our general opinion about these games. Consider subscribing, leaving a like. Please share this if you found it really interesting. We're trying to do something different here, just something that is maybe more personal. I hope you get some of that personal in what we talk about. But yeah, this is To Games It May Concern.